I think we could also be positive and feel positive in the sense that these new trees, these new communities, the small ones, are actually trained to adapt better, and they are doing better in adapting to this new climate. So not everything is lost.
This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Maryam, Pasha, the director and curator at TEDxLondon and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie. Hello, curious friends. Hello, Maryam.
Hello.
Hello. This week, I'm super excited. I am super excited because we've got a first on this episode of Climate Curious. We're going to be speaking to a rainforest expert from Oxford University.
Love Oxford, love a good rainforest.
And I think that it's safe to say that all of us think and believe deeply that rainforests are very important. But I feel like on a personal level, I've never actually stopped to ask why or how or when or where, any of those questions. And what do we do? Like, we know that they're really, really important, but like, what do we do about the fact that they're so important?
Lucky, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we have with us an expert to help us answer this question. So we're joined today by Associate Professor at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford, Dr. Jesús Aguirre Gutiérrez. And he's talking to us about some pretty exciting stuff. So rainforest, yes, but technology in the form of satellites, yes. Biodiversity in nature, yes. Tick, we're checking all of them. Fair to say, I think we're going to learn a lot.
I
mean, we are here at Oxford, so I'm like
my brain
here
is
to
already,
learn.
I feel like I'm just absorbing knowledge from the walls.
Let's dive straight into it. Thank you so much. Welcome, Jesús. We're here at Oxford. You're an associate professor here, but I want you to tell me just a little bit about your background and what you work on before we get into the real detail.
Who are you, man?
Who are you?
Okay. So I have to start. I'm Mexican. I grew up in there and I studied biology at the University of Guadalajara. And then I actually worked with indigenous communities for 2 years, living and working with them in the north of Mexico in the mountains, the Raramuri. And that actually connected me a lot more to nature and society and to biology, where I had studied. Then I moved to do a master's in the Netherlands in tropical ecology.
That's a big shift.
It's quite a big one. And I stayed there for almost 10 years, did my PhD as well in the Natural History Museum of the Netherlands.
Oh, wow. That must be very cool.
It was fantastic. Quite a change from the mountainous areas in Mexico to the flatlands.
Like the lowest of the lowest.
Riding bikes everywhere.
Really bad. And then I got a fellowship from the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research that brought me to Oxford, actually. It's kind of an outgoing fellowship.
Right.
From there, I've been here since 2017.
Growing up in Mexico and that first step, why this work? Why working with indigenous communities? Kind of all the things you could do, what was it that attracted you to starting down this path? I think
it was two main things. So Mexico is quite, I don't know if you can say it, unequal, really in social classes. So you have the very rich, which are kind of a minimum, and then the really, really poor, that is like, I don't know, 50% of the population or something like that, right? And I saw that since before I started in biology, but also after that. And this has a specific connotation as well about the kind of landscapes where these people live and the biodiversity they have in their landscape. And so that really took me into thinking about indigenous communities who live actually in the forest, what is happening with the biodiversity around them, because they really depend on it.
Right.
Well, they live on it.
It's their way of living.
It's their way of living. And that's why I felt like I want to know more, basically.
Right.
That took me to living with them.
That's incredible.
So interesting. So where do the poor people live, or the lower? You said it's linked to the biodiversity.
So, these specific communities live. They are called Raramuri, the indigenous communities. So you have across all Mexico different indigenous groups. Okay. And these lived in the north, in Chihuahua, which is the biggest state, close to the border with the US.
Okay.
And this is really mountainous terrain, and this is kind of coniferous forest, like pines, for instance.
Okay.
And they really depend on it.
Right.
And there are several of these locations where they live that are quite pristine to some extent, but others, they're actually totally deforested. There is nothing There is not much more, right? So they have to move around basically to trying to get better conditions for their living.
So you work with satellites to help map biodiversity. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Tell us a bit about your work here at Oxford and your work today.
Cool. Yes, sure. So since the beginning of my career, so what I've been doing, as I mentioned, is working directly with people in the places. And this gives you a very fine, detailed information about what is going on in their lands, right? And you can talk to people, they tell you what they are feeling, what is happening to the surroundings and the biodiversity there. But then the question is, how can you really extrapolate this knowledge to large scales, right? Is it the same happening in the north of Mexico than in the south? Is the same happening in Brazil or in Africa?
Right.
And that gave those were kind of the questions that I had at the beginning. And I think one of the approaches to actually try to answer some of these questions, trying to understand how biodiversity is responding to a stressor like climate change or land use change is using satellite data.
Right, right. So first of all, what are you seeing? You said there are changes, there are things happening. What is happening on the ground?
So you can think about this in, let's say, in two different ways. The first one is what is happening across a space. So comparing locations in the same time.
Okay.
So is this area kind of fuller, let's say, or it has more biodiversity based on the amount of forest that you see, based on the amount of water that you see in the image?
Right.
Biodiversity is plants.
Plants, it can be, you can see different things. Like with these satellite data that you have resolutions of centimeters, you can see animals, you can see elephants, for instance.
Okay.
You can quantify them as well.
So not like bacteria and stuff, but elephants.
Elephants, for instance.
The type of animals doesn't matter specifically. Sorry. That's just my brain being weird. But anything that you can see what's in an area.
Yes, exactly. You can see what is in an area. Like when you take a picture with your mobile phone, you kind of are almost seeing almost the same, but from the satellite.
Okay. Right? So it's like Google Maps. You're using the satellites for Google Maps.
Exactly.
Okay, I get that.
That kind of images. So, and then you can think as well about not only across a space, but also across time. Because these images, some of them actually, you can have them every day from the same location.
Right.
So you can see how a place has changed through time over the last year, the last 10 years, even the last 40 years. So that's what I'm doing, looking how biodiversity changes in a space and comparing locations, but also how it changes through time.
I have lots of questions. Just a basic one to start with for people listening and for me, I think, is how would you explain the link between like biodiversity? How is that important to climate conversation and climate change? What is the interaction between biodiversity and climate change?
I think one of the main links in here when you think about climate change is CO2 emissions. Okay. And most people are worried about our CO2 emissions because that have an impact in the rise of temperature.
Yep.
And if you think about basically who are the main individuals that contain those CO2 emissions or that carbon, is trees. They are one of the main ones, right?
Okay.
The ocean as well.
Yeah.
So if you're able to quantify how many trees, how much what we call biomass you have in an area, then you can think about how much they are absorbing the carbon that we are putting out in the atmosphere. And that's why it is very important to be able to quantify these.
Right. So can you talk to us about what are you seeing? Because I think that you're right. It's really interesting, not just to compare between, but to have this time kind of data of things and as they're changing. First of all, I guess, how far back can you go in terms of the data from satellite? How much data do you have? How far back can you go? How far back can you see?
I think one of the main satellites that has been going around is what they call the Landsat, is the name.
Yeah.
It's a family of satellites.
Okay.
And they go back to about, I think, the 70s, 80s. So basically you can have very good data over the past 40 years.
Wow.
And then you can see how much forest we have lost, how much forest we have actually recovered as well. If it actually is being lost in one area, but it's recovering in another area. So you can see the impacts that we are having on this vegetation. And then again, you can start thinking about quantifying quantifying how much carbon, let's say, we have lost to some extent to the atmosphere, and how much and where we are actually putting it down into the ground.
Right, because when you destroy these rainforests, they release the carbon that
they
they're
would
storing.
release the carbon, but also they release the carbon, and they are not capturing any more the carbon that was in there, right?
So it's a double whammy. It's like you're getting rid of the capture device, and the capture device is releasing all of the stuff.
Exactly, because it's decomposing.
Okay.
Right.
And so is your work, are you the person that puts the satellites up, or are you the person that looks at the photos?
I wish I knew how to put the satellites up. I love that.
You're not the astronaut.
I love it. No, but I actually use the data already.
Okay.
So this data from NASA.
Yeah.
But also the ESA, which is the European Space Agency, and they have fantastic satellites with really top-notch kind of images. And there are other also private companies. And these satellite data, again, it comes like really pixels. So these squares that you see from about 10 centimeters from the satellite, right? So you can actually really see a tree. You can start forming the image, the figure, because these pixels, like the pixels that you have in the TV or in your mobile phone camera, they are like 10 centimeters size.
Oh, wow.
So you can actually see single trees. It's when you zoom into Google Earth or Google Maps.
Right. I guess you can see someone's house.
And then you can see houses, cars, trees.
That's crazy.
I mean, so this is quite interesting.
I've got so many questions. I'm like, how many satellites are there? Where are they? Yeah, sorry. Keep going.
What I'm really curious to know, what are the patterns that you're seeing?
Yes. So general patterns, what we see now is that some forests, specifically talking about the tropics, I focus on the tropics.
Okay, so that's like where. So if people don't know, where is that? What part of the world are we looking at? We're looking at Brazil.
So you can think about the tropics like from central Mexico down all the way to southern Brazil. Okay. All the way when you go to Africa, then you can think about Ghana, Gabon, Cameroon.
Is all still in the tropics?
Congo.
So the Amazon and the Congo Basin, and they're all in this
Southeast
region.
Asia as well, Malaysia, Borneo, they are within the tropics.
Okay, and these are the most important rainforests, right? In a way, these are the rainforests that hold a lot of the carbon.
And they hold a lot of the biodiversity in general, animals, plants, and they carry out functions. And one of those functions is kind of holding the carbon, a lot of the carbon. And also one of the others that hold a lot of the carbon is the sea as well, right?
Yes. Right.
But I like to focus on the tropics.
Okay. So what are those patterns that you're seeing?
So we see that tropical forests across the different continents, they are responding in different ways.
Oh, interesting.
For instance, some of the African forests are kind of stabilizing in the carbon, seeing how much carbon they capture. This has happened also in the Amazon, and this is research that has been published in the last couple of years.
Okay.
So they are not capturing as much carbon, let's say.
So they're basically getting saturated or full.
To some extent, exactly.
Right.
And beyond that, also thinking about the biodiversity, and this is some new research that is soon to be published, is that if you think about the tropical Americas, these tropical areas in the Americas, we quantified how the communities of plants have changed through time over the last 40 years.
Right.
So we see that we wanted to see how much they are kind of in the path of tracking or adapting to increasing temperature. Right. And if they are, where they are adapting better, and where they are not potentially adapting to this new climate, right?
Right.
So what we see is that most of these communities actually are not adapting as fast as we wish they would be adapting.
Right.
And this is when you think about these big trees, right? Because they cannot move.
Right.
What they can do is either adapt to where they are, to the new conditions, die or disperse, right, with the seeds. But if you think about dispersal, how far can a seed travel and how long in time it would need to, let's say, jump from the Amazon to the mountains in the Andes, which they are a bit cooler,
right?
Potentially with better temperature.
Yeah.
So it would take a lot of time.
And they have to survive. And
they have to survive.
So what happens when they're not adapting? What are you seeing happening to these trees and these other plants there that are not adapting to the change.
So what we see now, this is with the big trees, right? But if you think, we were thinking, what is happening with the newcomers, with the seedlings? What kind of characteristics they have?
Oh, interesting.
And we see that those newcomers, into the ones that are surviving and they are seeds and they start growing, they have these new traits that we call them like new characteristics in the leaves and the kind of wood they have. And it seems that these characteristics are more in line into this adaptation to higher temperatures and lower precipitation. So what we think is that this forest of the future, these things, small seedlings, may be the forest of the future. So we are now kind of trying to understand, okay, these are the traits that we should think about when we are thinking about reforestation programs, for instance.
Right.
Because they are the ones that we see that are doing better now. The type of species are becoming more abundant.
Oh, I see. So those species that are more suited to this.
to the areas. Okay.
They are becoming more abundant.
And is that good, bad? Like, how are we supposed to feel about, like, if I'm...
This sounds very scary. It sounds like things like I feel like I'm not saying anything because I'm just kind of waiting for bad news. Is this bad news or is it good news, or like should we feel positive or scared about it?
Or something else.
Or something else, or another emotion.
I mean, to some extent, we should keep in mind that we are putting too much carbon gases into the atmosphere, and we have to modify that. And this is a result, like these changes that we see, or the lack of change in the biodiversity is a result of these. But I think we could also be positive and feel positive in the sense that these new trees, these new communities, the small ones, are actually trying to adapt better, and they are doing better in adapting to this new climate.
Right.
So not everything is lost.
Yeah,
that's what I'm trying to say.
And you said you called them forests of the future, which is a really interesting way of describing it. Because in my mind, a forest is like a expendable resource. It's like that's the wrong way of saying it, but it's like a thing that once it's gone, and you can't get a new one because it takes a long time for trees to grow, right? But does that mean that forests move and change over time? Like, can we expect new forests in the mountains to start to appear?
Yes, I think, I mean, it takes time.
Yeah.
But they are dynamic. Okay. So they are changing. And I think what we are seeing now is that the forests are still there, but the kind of species that you have is changing. So it's like kind of the faces of the forest are changing around.
Right.
This is being kind of reshuffled.
Yeah.
Right.
But it is still the rainforest. Perhaps better, like trying to prepare for these environments that are drier and that are hotter.
Right. I have lots of questions. Obviously, there are communities that I'm assuming some of the indigenous communities that you worked who rely on these forests for their livelihoods, who've taken care of these forests for generations. What's the impact of these changes on those communities there?
Sure. I think it kind of depends to where you are as well. There are some areas that are more impacted than others. If just talking, for instance, about this tropical forest in Mexico and the communities that live in there. So most of the work that we do here at Issey and in my lab, basically, we try to work together with the communities that are on the ground and also with the local partners from each country because they know exactly the reality, right? And there are some areas that definitely people have had to move around to find some other locations where they can find basically the things that they need to survive. But there are others that are also communities that are trying to adapt to these new conditions, making use of the species that are becoming more abundant, actually helping also with the restoration and reforestation programs, collecting the seeds from the trees, and basically trying to kind of make this a bit more sustainable as well. So they get their livelihoods as well from working in these kind of areas, right?
Right.
But definitely there has been a negative impact on them and the livelihoods, but I guess several of them or most of them are actually trying to adapt and just work with it and work with the different organizations that are dealing with these issues.
You mentioned earlier that one of the ways that you can apply this understanding is in reforestation efforts. So like if there are certain species that are better adapted and surviving to these new climate, that as we try to reforest, we we use those species more. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that application of what you're seeing. Like, how do you see it influencing adaptation work like this, or even like try and stop the deforest? Like, I'm just curious to see how that work gets applied.
Yeah, sure. So I think just thinking about the most direct and simple ways, there are these different programs from the UK and let's say the European Union. For instance, these, I don't know, what was 3 billion trees? Right? But these are kind of reforestation programs that are going on, not only in Europe, but also a lot in the tropics.
Yes.
And also you have these programs to some extent are incentivizing some commercial companies to do kind of reforestation programs, but by using kind of plantations as well, just 1 or 2 species, right?
Right.
I think just using 1 or 2 species that sometimes are not actually from the location is quite dangerous.
Yes.
So what we are trying to do in here is to bring more tools for this decision making about which species to plant where in case reforestation is needed. Okay. So what kind of characteristics those species that you are going to select would have to actually have an opportunity as well to survive.
To grow and
right.
to be
because
able
a
to
lot
coexist.
of the ones that are being used then just basically die after, I don't know, 1 year or 2 years. Right. So I think that would be kind of the most direct application.
And that's a difficult thing, right? Because that's not the kind of thing you could figure out I would assume, without a satellite. Like, you'd need to be able to map what's going on everywhere else to be able to know what would work here.
Yeah, the scale of it.
Yeah. So interesting.
Are you surprised that you're using satellite technology with this work? Like, I'm just curious to know whether you ever imagined this is kind of how you would be doing this, and what that journey has been like.
That's very funny, because I remember when I was a child and I would be in a plane. I remember that part, and when you look into like through the window, you see like the landscape, right?
Yeah.
And I always wonder, like, what do we have down there? I always wanted to know, like, what is down there? What happened if I actually jump and I'm actually scared of heights. So
not literally.
Exactly. And so in that sense, I'm not surprised. I actually kind of find a link to what I'm doing nowadays. But to the beginning, if you think about it, you go to a place and you collect the data that you need to try to understand the local context. Mm-hmm. So you measure the tree, you measure the leaves, you send them to the lab and get the chemical composition. That's for 1, 2, 3, 10 trees. Now, like, let's see what is happening elsewhere. Again, you have to build models, collect a lot of data from the field, go to different communities across the tropics, gather your data, do your statistics, and then think, okay, how can I then put it out no more to the places where I haven't been? What is there? Right. Is when we use the satellite data to basically make a prediction of what we found for those locations, but across the world, let's say.
I think you hear a lot about the reforestation, deforestation, losing the Amazon, trying to get it back, etc. Do you have a sense through this work, you and your teams, like whether we are stopping deforestation, whether forests are coming back, or whether it's actually still being lost at a really fast pace? One of the things that I've read about is that, since the end of the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, that there's been a slowing of the deforestation. Is that real? Can you see that? Are you seeing it in real time?
Yes, definitely. I think, the rate of deforestation to some extent has slowed down for some of these locations. For others, for instance, perhaps in some areas in Africa or in southern Mexico, it's still kind of in the same pace or even faster. But I think we are doing great in the sense like people know this is happening, and we are trying to slow it down. So there is really a future for this, and I think we have to be positive and keep positive about it. We can do something about it. Right.
I'm curious because I guess I'm wondering, like, what are the things that you're starting to see contribute to it slowing down versus it speeding up? Like, is it the governments? Is it do you analyze those kinds of factors? Or
I per se, I don't do it. But what I see it is definitely something that governments can push for, like this slowing down of deforestation, do something, implement policy. But at the same time, personally, I think it is about the consumer as well, knowing more about what you are buying, where is it coming from.
Reducing the demand.
Exactly.
So
it's also, are your products, like if you're talking about wood certified.
Right.
So just getting to know a bit more. I know it is difficult for most of us.
Yeah.
But actually trying to know where it's coming from and the history that it has.
Yeah. I mean, this is probably very much outside your scope, but I'm just curious if, because you're in this every day, for people listening who don't know this, what are some of the things that lead to deforestation?
Okay. I think one of them is going to be poverty.
Okay.
Poverty is going to lead to deforestation.
Right.
Wait, I'm agreeing, and I don't understand how. Why would poverty mean that people would cut more trees down for wood, for firewood?
For instance, I think this applies to several countries. Again, putting more into the context of Brazil or Mexico, is people live in these forested areas, and if they don't have a way of making money from any other business, they are often faced with the position in which they can cut wood illegally to sell also to illegal buyers perhaps, right? And this is leading to deforestation. This is happening a lot in Mexico, for instance, even in protected areas.
Right.
These are huge areas, huge countries in which perhaps policy implementation is not adequate, or there is not enough funding. And also there is not enough funding for people living in these, enough jobs. Right. And this is obviously creating kind of this feedback loop that is quite negative.
I don't think we do enough of that joined up thinking, because of these social and economic factors that then lead to environmental factors, if that makes sense. But this idea that,
It does make sense.
if people need to live, then they're going to have to do whatever's necessary. And actually, in a way, it's as simple as being like, what can we find? If we address poverty, then we have two wins. People aren't living in poverty anymore, and we're protecting the forests, the environment. In your research and the work that you've done, what was the most surprising thing that you found?
It was actually very interesting to see that a lot of the areas across the tropics where I work, they are still quite, I could say, pristine. I didn't imagine I could still find those areas.
Wow.
In which you get into the forest and then you see these huge trees, like you cannot see almost the end in the canopy. You can hug them, but you cannot cover them, So this was quite surprising. It's like, these areas they are still there,
And do you go visit? Have you gone and seen some of these rainforests and areas that you've been also photographing?
I've been in several of them, several countries. So Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, with local collaborators. We have been even in Chile, a bit outside of the tropics, but it's still fantastic forests. In Africa, we have been a lot in Ghana. We work quite strongly and a lot in Ghana, Gabon, Malaysia in Asia, as well, Rwanda. So all over the place. And you still can find these very nice locations, very nice conserved forests full of biodiversity across these tropical continents.
Oh, that's good.
So I would say let's try to actually focus also in these areas, conserving these areas without forgetting also kind of the ones that need more kind of reforestation or care at the same time.
That's beautiful.
Of those areas that you've mentioned, how many of them are reaching capacity? Because it is part of this that we need to be creating more forests actively, or is nature just going to kind of sort itself out and we don't need to worry about it that much?
No, I think that's a great question. I think we have to be active, and do something about it. Kind of stop this, for instance, deforestation and forest degradation. Again, this comes into policy as well, poverty reduction.
Right.
But at the same time, if you think about the extent, right, of these forests, there is only so much that we can do actively, and there is only so much money that we can actually put into these programs, right? So one of the ideas that has been hugely discussed is, yes, let's continue actually investing a lot in this actively, but let's also protect and some areas perhaps let them be let them recover by themselves, take away the pressure,
Right.
so that they can
Stop trying to do stuff to it and just let it, just stop it from being interfered with.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it is going to be easier if in those locations that are degraded, that you have still kind of some pockets of biodiversity that can help the system recover. But perhaps if you don't have anything left, then is when you have to be more active, right? Act in for those locations.
So interesting. And I feel like over the time that we've been doing this podcast, I've learned little bits and pieces about what it means to like reforest an area. So does this look like, in terms of practical steps, not practical steps for someone like me, but practical steps for the scientists, for the people that are doing this work, does that mean introducing, like you mentioned, new like evolution of plants or mutation of characteristics of plants that you can introduce to an area? Or are we talking about introducing new animals? Do we need to put like new wolves or something into an area? So that, because I know that sometimes it's not necessarily the thing that you immediately think you need to change that needs to change. Do you have any idea of like what things, can you tell that from a satellite, like which animals need to be placed in which areas or which plants we need to put in a specific place?
I think from the satellite, it's easier to see the plants, like the big plants that are in a given area. But coming back to the point about which kind of plants, if we have to bring new species, let's say, to a location, I would say that is at this stage, it would be better to use some of the plants, some of the species that you have in the location, in the surroundings, because it means that to some extent they are kind of adapting or trying to still be there. They are fighting. Right. So let's not try to introduce kind of new species from other locations, I would say. Just use what you have in there. Select the ones that are doing best. Right. But also, you talk about animals, and they are very important. Very important for dispersal, for instance. There are many tree species that need animals to disperse the seeds.
Right.
And in areas, for instance, in the Amazon, in which you have a lot of defaunation, then this is becoming an issue because the tree may be there and the seed may be there, but it doesn't have a way to go to other locations, to travel away.
So I know how this happens, but I want you to tell Ben how this happens, because I don't think, do you know how an animal disperses the seed?
It's doo-doo, right? It's they poop. Yeah. They take it, and then they literally carry it to another place.
Several of them, some others just get it stuck into the food.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, everyone. Listen, it doesn't have to be that crude all the time. Sorry.
No, the one that you mentioned is very important as well.
These are the tapirs.
Yeah. So what does it look like? Like if we start thinking 10 to 20 years in the future, because we're at, like, in my mind, when we're having climate conversations, we're at crisis point and we're close to irreparable damage. What does it look like 10 years into the future? When is that? 2035?
2035
2035.
No, 5 years into the future, 2030.
5 years into the future. What does it look like? No, 10 years. Anyway, maths. But what does it look like in the future if this goes well? If your work carries on going well, what is your hope for what the world looks like? Or 10 years, 20 years? Give us 3, 5, 10, 20.
No, I think what I would expect to see more is this policy that is evidence-based. And this means then the application of this knowledge that we are gathering at the different universities across the world with the different research that is going on being applied into these areas specifically. And this means then again, thinking about if you are now, tomorrow, or in the next month, planning a reforestation action in a given location, then start using that data that all scientists are putting out there to actually take action in the field. I would like to see, obviously, less poverty, more support for the local communities as well that live actually in these locations and that are the primary users of these tropical forests, for instance. So that's what I would like to see more in the next 5 to 10 years. If you think about what kind of forest we may have in the next 10 years, I think that's quite short term, because if you think of a tree when it is planted, then it takes a long time, several years to actually reach 2-3 meters, 4 meters. It depends what they are. But perhaps in the next 50 years, we are going to see perhaps some changes also in the forest, in the composition of species they have. And hopefully forests that are better adapted to these new environmental conditions.
When you're looking at a satellite image of a forest, how can you tell if something is healthy, if something is degraded? Like, what will I be seeing?
What are the markers?
Yeah.
Right. Oh, that's very important. So when you just transport yourself to these Google Maps.
Yes, I've got Google
In the
Maps.
satellite image.
Yeah.
So when you zoom in, then you have no forest. You just see the bare ground. Like it can be just kind of brownish.
Right.
There are no trees. You can see that. You can see where you have grasses as well. And you can see also where you have the trees. You see the canopies.
Okay.
And there are some techniques that you can actually click into one of the pixels, and then you see what we call a spectral signature.
Okay.
And the spectra is basically energy that is reflected from the surface. So that when you see the signature, it's basically telling you that it can tell you many different things. It can help you identify, for instance, if it is really, really brown, perhaps it is a tree that is quite unhealthy, a bit sick. If it is very, very green, then it may mean that it's doing a lot of photosynthesis, so perhaps it's quite healthy.
Right.
But that also helps us identify different species,
Right.
because different species have kind of different
signatures,
fingerprints, different signatures. And so when you start looking about, where are these species distributed? Exactly. So you can start gathering a lot of these signatures and see how many different species you have.
Wow.
And it works kind of the same way when you think about the nutrients composition, how much nitrogen they have, how much phosphorus they have. We can also analyze that through the spectral signature that they have.
So in the UK, we talk a lot about rewilding. For people who are familiar with rewilding, how can that help them understand what you're talking about? Like, is there anything similar or analogous to that kind of concept?
I think it's just bringing nature back where it used to be. And rewilding has a huge impact. For instance, when I was talking about the seed dispersal,
Right.
again, and this rewilding is happening here in the UK. Actually, we have the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery, in which a lot of analysis about rewilding, what kind of species are missing. We're working here in the UK, and we're working also in Ghana. Just thinking about first, what kind of animals need to come back? What are the species that we used to have in here that are not here anymore, and what kind of functions they used to do.
Right.
So it's difficult again to see kind of these small animals with satellites, but we can see like elephants,
Right.
zebras, and so they are very important species also across the tropics.
Is there anywhere people can go and actually see some of the images that you're looking at, like of the forests or any of this? Like, if people are really interested,
yes, I mean
just go to Google Maps.
Google Maps is one of the most obvious ones, and there are the websites of the European Space Agency.
Great.
They have fantastic images. They can if you just Google the European Space Agency,
Great.
Sentinel-2 images.
Sentinel-2 images. We'll put that in the show notes. So if anyone really wants to have a look, because I want to go look at some forests.
Yeah, I feel, this is my question actually, is if I care, like if I'm somebody, so imagine it's like 100,000 people like me who don't have any scientific knowledge or background in this. Like, what can the average layperson do with this information? Like, how do you, if you care about biodiversity, or you care about rewilding, or you care about any of that kind of stuff, what is a practical step? Are there any practical steps that a person can take to like be involved or support? Is it like planting stuff in your garden, or is it? Well, I'm big on gardening.
Ben asked, you need context.
I started a garden.
Ben asked this context because one of our previous guests told him to start a garden.
Yeah, I'm like, how should I start my garden? Every episode, I'm trying to build information on starting a garden.
But I guess it's a good question. Like, is this what you said before about us as consumers, or is there other ways that we, as people not working in this, take this information and knowledge?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things you can do is just join a local group as well. There are a lot of local groups about trying to protect local biodiversity. Join about like basically exploring the surrounding areas. Help in the citizen science projects as well that come out quite frequently as well. Recently, there was one about, in this case, water quality.
Okay.
All across the UK. People joined it, collected water from the different rivers, and send it back to this organization that then made the chemical analysis and gave you insights about how clean your water is. There is also some
I
of
already
these.
know what the answer is in my area. Yeah, I don't need to know. Yeah, good point.
So just join this. I would say this is one very practical one. Just join also like the local groups.
Local groups,
and
yeah.
participate.
Fantastic.
I like that.
Is there any other technology that you kind of see coming on the horizon for your work that really excites you?
Yeah, definitely. So within the satellite, we have this remote sensing. Remote sensing includes not only satellite, but something kind of that can tell you information without basically touching it, right?
Right.
And one of those is also camera traps. For instance, these cameras that researchers
Yes.
put in the forest, and they take a picture when something moves. And it can be a jaguar, or it can be a tapir or something.
Amazing.
But also these kind of audio modes or kind of audio recorders that you also put in the forest, and you leave it in there for days or weeks, and then you bring it to your computer. You have AI models now that can help you identify what potential species it is of what kind of animal.
This has been a very cool conversation.
Yeah.
And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
So we've confessed over
It's
100
humiliating.
confessions
It's
each.
humiliating.
So we're trying to figure it
Embarrassing.
out. Do you have one?
I feel like something to do with ice cream. Do you know what I realized the other day? I don't know if this will count, but I realized that people are boycotting stuff. And I don't boycott anything. Like I don't, and maybe Starbucks. I don't know. Shout out to Starbucks boycotting you. But I feel like there's got to be something that I can be changing in my consumption that would be helping rather than hindering the situation. I think that's probably the confession is I don't even pay enough attention to what I'm consuming to know what the impact of the items I use like regularly, day-to-day use, like whether my washing up liquid is good or bad, or my toilet roll is good or bad.
And we know,
have a suspicion.
We learn about the pizza box. The pizza boxes coming from ancient trees. Yeah.
And so I'm wondering,
Really
but
cool,
I'll
very
do
cool.
some research and I'll find out for the next episode what it is that I'm doing specifically so that I can confess again.
Something actually that I haven't done, but I should be doing, which is I haven't really participated much in this March for the Environment protest that came. But also the other one that I've been doing that I shouldn't be doing so much, perhaps is I shouldn't be eating so much meat.
The meat is yours. Yeah, we just had chicken.
Yeah, we just had delicious. Yeah.
That's a tough one. Yeah, because obviously also I guess you see how the forests are being cut down for cattle farming, right? So
Exactly.
Yeah.
yeah. My one's gonna get boring. My one's gonna get boring as this goes on. I now have a baby, and what I've realized is that in the past, where I had the time and energy to think carefully about the things I'm buying, sometimes you're just like, give me this thing, and so although for myself, I kind of completely avoid fast fashion, I do realize that they just grow so fast.
Yeah.
But, I will say that I have lots of friends who have babies, so I've gotten lots of secondhand stuff, but you still think, let me just buy like 10 more of those vests.
In case I need them.
And you do, because as you saw over lunch, he throws up on everything.
Yeah. And he's doubled in size. He's grown quick.
I definitely think that's my climate confession, is that when you're tired as a parent, you definitely think, I don't have time for this. I need sleep. So that's my climate confession. Thank you so much.
Thank you, man.
This was really awesome. Thank you for letting us be your first podcast.
Yeah.
I think you did excellent. And we will link to a lot of things we talked about in the show so people can find your work and find some of the stuff we were talking about. But thank you again.
No, fantastic. Thank you for having me and for taking the time, actually.
You are so welcome. And remember, stay curious. Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the reviews section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Colter, artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus,
Curation by Maryam Pasha.
mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshty,
Music also by Ben Beheshty
Presented by Ben Hurst
and Maryam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.